The action of the story begins in an imperial city. People are celebrating the quincentenary anniversary of the founding of the empire, and the streets of the city are very crowded with people who have come out to celebrate the event. A beautifully dressed woman is heading somewhere. She says the time has finally come, and it's been years of waiting for this day. She tells the people who look at her warily that her house still stands, and it is they who will witness the return of Alicia Maffand. Further, we learn that a temperate climate, fertile lands, a prosperous estate in which the soul flourishes, and an illustrious family in which for centuries famous knights have been born. This is all about this girl's family and her estate, Her parents were the most distinguished and illustrious aristocrats in the West. She had a reliable brother and his wife, who was like a ray of sunshine to them. Her family was her pride and joy. All these are the memories of a girl from her childhood. She also mentions that she forgot to tell about the new member of the family that her father brought in one fine morning. Then her father said that from that day on this girl would live with them. Her name was Ophelia. Ophelia was a sweet girl with divine powers. And most importantly, the heroine was beyond thrilled to find a little sister and a friend to keep her company. Ophelia puts on Alicia's head a wreath of flowers in Teresia. She tells Alicia that she is very beautiful with this wreath, as if she was born to wear it. Then their life was beautiful, and the girl thought that the goddess Maera smiles at them. She believed that their happiness will last forever. But all good things are bound to end. Everything was fine in their life until the black clouds descended on them. It all started with the arrival of a boy named Nyx. From the beginning, he seemed very suspicious to the girl. She saw in his eyes something very suspicious. However, her sister Ophelia treated him with kindness. She brought this lad into their home, despite the girl's protest. In her opinion, it was the only mistake the Holy Virgin made. From then on, wherever Ophelia went, Nyx followed her. But despite the obvious signs, she was so blinded by her dislike for him that she didn't realize that the cause of his obsession was not the girl herself, but her divine power. The young wanderer Nyx turned out to be a vicious priest who worshipped the dark god Arpho, and her sister's divine power was the key that would awaken the dark god from his slumber. Nyx's goal was to extract divine power from Ophelia for Afro, but when he failed, he unleashed the hellish power of his god on their estate. When this happened, thousands of people were sacrificed during the ritual. This gruesome footage is just mind-boggling. Also, during the ritual, along with other people, her family was sacrificed. She remembers how her older brother during the battle did not yell to her to save herself. Everything she loved so much was taken away from her in an instant by the eyes. The girl remembers how a giant hand, created as if from black energy, almost grabbed her. She was terrified of everything that was happening, and then she thought it was the end. But when she awoke, she found herself in a vast, empty manor. She was lying on the floor, with her little nephew Alfred, the child crying in the girl's arms. On the floor of the manor, in the distance, something sparkled. She looks there and realizes it's her father's ring. That day was the naming day of her life. That's when everything changed. That day the girl promised herself to do whatever it took to survive, and to restore the house of Melfont from the ruins. And when she restored her family's name, Alfred, as her only relative, would accept the ring and continue their lineage. As for her sister Ophelia, who is the cause of the whole tragedy, and who also survived with her, she felt a burning hatred and resentment against her for leaving her half-sister to die alone and just running away. But all that happened allowed her to become the person she is today. To achieve what she wanted, she put away her pride and took up a trade as a wine merchant, and through her hard work, she rebuilt her family home in just 10 years. Behind her, over a glass of wine, 2 men are discussing her jewelry and its size. They think it must be worth a fortune. Then they claim the witch made her fortune selling wine. They're surprised she calls you an aristocrat, mocking her. The girl turns to them as she has heard everything. The men look visibly startled that a woman is approaching them. She tells them they can go into Romdak. When they have time, she mentions that their jewelry is for the imperial family, but she will let them look at it. Then, clinking glasses with the man, she says she's not sure they have enough money to buy them. Then the girl turns around and walks away, thinking that all these people can only gossip behind their backs. To her, the dignity of an aristocrat means nothing, for in the end she is merely making way for herself and her dear nephew Alfred, until he can manage things for himself. Fireworks explode beautifully in the sky. A girl looks at this and says that these fireworks are a waste of money, and the government needs to reconsider how they spend their tax dollars. Suddenly, the girl looks forward. Right not far from her, there is a very strong explosion. She is very surprised by it and does not understand what is happening. Standing on the earth, she thinks that there is no time to waste, and she needs to get out of here as soon as possible. On her finger, we can notice her father's ring. Apparently, since the tragedy happened, she still hasn't taken it off. The girl feels something strange. She thinks about something but comes to think that it is impossible, but then realizes that the impossible is true. In front of her appears the same Nyx. He tells Alicia Melfont that they have not seen each other for a long time. His look is empty, cruel, and very crazy. The angry girl looks at him, but he says that he is surprised that the girl survived. He emphasizes that she is stubborn. This time we can see behind him a whole retinue of people, led by Nyx himself. The angry girl in her head. She tells him she can say the same about him. She heard the priests sealed him the same day he killed her men. But it seems he was able to slip away like a little stalker, and she thought his corpse was safely rotting in the dungeon. She calls him a disgrace. A happy Nyx tells the girl that she's still as sharp as ever, but then looks around and asks where she's hidden it. The protagonist doesn't know what she's talking about. But Nyx looks at her and asks if her half-sister Ophelia is here. Alicia thinks about what a sick bastard he is, because just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, he remembers her half-sister. Alicia wonders how to hold him off until the priests arrive. She suddenly has a plan, and asks Nyx if he really doesn't know about it, while not missing the point of calling him a pathetic scumbag. Nyx is confused. He can't understand what the protagonist is talking about. She looks at Nyx and sees him immediately change his face. She asks herself if her plan worked. A crazy smile appears on Nyx's face. He says that it's a lie. Apparently he knows that her stepsister is still alive. The same hand that chased the girl at that tragic moment appears from behind him. A giant hand attacks her. The girl is frightened, but after receiving a strong blow, immediately fell unconscious. When she woke up, it was too late. Nyx's subjects take her captive and take her somewhere. She can't believe her life is in danger again because of her half-sister she hasn't seen in so long. She curses Ophelia. After the girl was carried away from the place, she was thrown unconscious into the dungeon, and her hands were chained so that she could not go anywhere. The men who will be watching her are told to keep an eye on her and to expect an order from Mr. Nyx. After the protagonist wakes up, she wonders where she is now and what will happen to her next, and that she can't die here. She has to take care of Malash Alford and her wine business. She makes you get up off the floor and motivates you to keep your spirits up. She says she has to come to her senses because people are waiting for her. There are a lot of bats in the dungeon with her. They hang from the ceiling. Suddenly a light appears around her, but not the usual light, but violet. She looks around. Her hands have lost their shackles. She doesn't understand what's happening. The first thought after she saw it was that she was dreaming. The girl thinks she must have just blacked out. A light falls on some book. It glows as if it were a gift from God. The girl looks at it and is surprised that there is a book next to her. A girl walks up to this book and picks it up while laughing that she saw the book floating in a pond, asking herself jokingly what will happen next and what other unrealistic things will happen. After picking up the book, she immediately reads the title. It's called Ophelia's Night, not happy with what she sees. The girl immediately says it's definitely not a funny story. She opens the book and begins to read what it says. It turned out that it described the story of her life. When she realized that it was all about her, the girl was very surprised. With each page turned, the book revealed the terrible truth about the events that actually happened that tragic night. It turns out that when the mad Nyx brought death and decay to the Melfont estate, Ophelia, without wasting time, rushed to the aid of little Alfred. The girl took the little boy in her arms and ran with him, and she was heading straight for her sister Alicia. But when she got to her, the girl's life force had been given to the dark god. The girl is surprised to realize that the memories are still fuzzy, but they are slowly coming back to her. We learn that at that moment the demonic hand really grabbed her, and for a few seconds the girl died. Then she tried to run away from it with horror, but apparently she did not succeed. At that moment, her stepsister Ophelia used most of her powers to bring the protagonist back to life after all. Apparently the girl did not turn out to be a traitor as Alicia had previously thought, and the remnants of her divine power the girl used to seal Nyx's fallen priest with a powerful beam that pierced the Nyx who was then attacking them. When the messenger of the dark god was defeated, the world seemed at peace. However, 10 years later, the remaining followers of Nyx devised a way to free him from his chains. Thanks to their efforts, Arfo's servant awoke from his long slumber. And after his release, Nyx once again went in search of Ophelia. Reading all this in the book, the protagonist guesses that means Nyx came to the capital because he felt the divine power of Ophelia in her. Now Alicia understands a little more than before, which explains why Nyx asked her about Ophelia. She realizes that if she can harness her half-sister's power, she'll deal him a serious blow. But she still doesn't know how to do it. The girl decides to keep reading the book. Maybe it will have more clues about it. She still hasn't moved from where she found the book. Story in the middle of the pond starts to read it further. After she started reading, it took her a little while to realize that she had missed one very important fact. The title of the book implies that the main character of the story is Ophelia, and not Alicia herself. The book goes on to say that Nyx traveled to the far corner of the kingdom where he built a veritable citadel of Tonyoros, then tried to lure Ophelia into his lair by sending her half-sister to her piece by piece. At one point, Ophelia responded to such a grim invitation, and came to Nyx. She begged him to stop while he held Alicia above the ground by the throat. Nyx thanked Alicia Melfont that it was her desperate will to live that brought the holy maiden right into his arms. After he thanked her right in front of her half-sister, Nyx slit Alicia's throat. Reading all this, the girl is very much shocked by what she sees and does not understand what it all means, but conclude that apparently she is destined to die. She is furious and says that she does not agree with it because her half-sister gave her divine power, and she cannot die so easily, and if she uses this power, she can heal any wounds. The girl turns the page and begins to read on. And then it says that as soon as Nyx's blade split Alicia's flesh, the divine power that had kept her alive for 10 years returned to its owner. Ophelia's power returned to her, giving her even greater strength of mind, body, and spirit. Then she created a sword with her power, and armed with divine strength and anger, this time sealing the fallen priest forever, thus preventing the return of the dark god. So ended the story of Ophelia, Mayra's favorite and the savior of humanity. Alicia stares at the open book in a stupor and thinks about everything she has read. As she cries, she asks what they mean by that. Do they want her to die for her half-sister Ophelia's happy ending? After the protagonist has calmed down, has finished crying, she says there is no way that everything in the book will happen, because she doesn't agree with it. She looks very determined. Alicia puts the book back where she got it, and says it's just a bad dream that will soon be over. But the shock still lingers on her face, still dumbfounded by what she read. She realizes that she needs to wake up from this nightmare, because her little nephew Alfred is waiting for her, and besides, the people of Melfont need her. She grabs her head and tries to wake up from the supposedly terrible dream. She tries to wake up, but she feels nothing changes. Only we can notice around her that it is as if she has moved back to the dungeon she was in before. She still doesn't realize that she has moved to another place. She asks herself why she can't wake up, but suddenly, as if awake, she opens her eyes and sees the shackles on her arms that hold her tightly here. She looks around and realizes that this is a fortress built in the wasteland, with Imperial troops in the distance. She looks through the netting and sees nothing but sharp mountains and voices screaming for help and release. Alicia realizes they're holding prisoners here for sacrifice to a dark god. Suddenly, the voice of a fallen priest is also heard. Nyx says that let the dark god Arfo accept and guide their souls to the depths of hell. The girl clenches her fist and thinks that Nyx's perverted speeches are only making things worse. She is not hard to understand, because not only are there a lot of voices being tormented, but Nyx is also making his speeches. It is at this moment that she realizes that it is their Tanyaros, the lair of the fallen priest Nyx. The situation is very gloomy. Around the dungeon in which the girl is kept, there are bats flying. And right in front of the dungeon, there is a fire burning. The dungeon itself is made in the mountain. The girl looks at the shackles she's wearing and says she hoped his servants had tampered with the chains, but realizes they're not, because they're just heavy, covering her face with her hand. She says it's funny how things can go on in a book. She suddenly realizes a terrible fact, because if everything goes according to the plot of the book, does it mean that she will die here? The girl is very sad, because by all accounts she is going to die a quick death here. But the girl, who is not used to never give up, says that even in this situation cannot give up. In her opinion, there must be some way out, and if the book she read is not lying, it means only one thing. And once she figures out how to use it, it'll be a lot easier to escape from this horrible place. Clenching her fist again, as if gathering all her will there, the girl says that maybe she can even use the power that flows in her to hit that bastard Nyx, and then he will pay for what he did to the house and her family. The girl's look expresses an incredible confidence that can't help but surprise in a man who sits in the dungeon of his worst enemy. As if from a mountain on steps to it descends some man. He asks whether this camera belongs to Alicia, on what receives the affirmative answer. The girl hears all this. She brainstormed in the dungeon, trying to figure out how her half-sister had used her powers. At this point, she clutched the chains from the shackles in her hands. She realizes that she needs to do something before these people grab her too. In her thoughts, she starts asking Ophelia for help and crossing her arms. A bright yellow glow appears right from her palms. The followers of the fallen priest in the street cannot understand why there was a strange sound. One of them says that it must be the dark god answered the prayers of Mr. Nyx. The other rejoices in it, saying that finally the Lord of Hell will set foot on this earth. With guns in their hands, they open the door to the cell where the protagonist is. One of them says to bring Alicia to Mr. Nyx. Standing by the door, the other tells her to come out of her dungeon. The protagonist, kneeling on her knees, did not even move when she heard the order. She is still humbly standing in the center of her dungeon. The followers of Nyx are looking at each other and do not understand what is happening, and why she did not obey their words. After all, she is still their prisoner. With a mad expression on her face and with a glowing forehead, the protagonist, freed from the shackles that these people put on her, tells them that if they want to see hell on earth, then she will give it to them. On the top of the mountain, visible bright yellow glow, we realize that her dungeon was not just in the mountain, but on its top. Thanks to the divine power, the girl was able to defeat two subordinates of the fallen priest. Everything that happens for the girl is incredible. She realizes that everything that was written in the book was true, and all this time the power of half-sister slept in her. It is as if she were addressing a writer whose book she had read while in prison, telling him that he had wasted paper on writing this book, for he was very much mistaken in thinking that Alicia would accept such a miserable end. She also tells him to just wait, because no amount of ink or paper will save his book from the chaos she's about to wreak. Her frantic expression surprised, more and more bright lights around her. The girl thinks that the technique she used was quite effective, because she went from the top floor to the bottom floor quite quickly, thanks to a simple fall, and without taking any damage. She clenches all her will into a fist and thinks about her next actions. Her plan at this point saying that right now she needs to focus on getting out of this horrible place in one piece. She knows that her nephew Alfred is waiting for her, and that's why she decides to brainstorm one more time. She starts thinking how she can get out of this place. Suddenly, other followers of the fallen priest Nyx appear from nowhere with a torch in their hands. They notice her and start chasing her. The girl tries to escape from them, but one of them catches her by her long dress, after which she falls to the ground. She turns to her pursuers and, standing on the ground, realizes that this stupid dress has interfered with her. Looking at them, the girl is surprised to see that they cannot approach her, and as if there is some invisible wall between them, in which her pursuers are trapped. She doesn't understand what these idiots are doing here, but finally realizes that her power seems to have created a barrier to keep them away from her. She smiles, obviously pleased at the fact that they can't get near her. She picks up her dress takes it in her hands and says that this piece of cloth will be the only thing they will get from her. With a deft movement of her hand, the girl tears her long dress, apparently so that next time it will not interfere with her. All the while from her face does not leave a smile. The main character's exasperated pursuers who are behind the barrier she created, yelling at her that she's a coward, trying to somehow get through the barrier to her to grab. She gets up from the earth. You can see that the girl is covered in abrasions, and her dress is torn very badly. Apparently, she didn't tear off just a small piece, but tore almost the whole half of her red dress. She comes to the barrier behind which her pursuers are, and looks at them with a very angry look. We can see that her fist is still clenched, which lets us know that she is ready to fight back at any moment, and she touches the barrier and says that the power of her half-sister Ophelia has once again saved her. But she says she's not going to thank her sister for that power, and smiling wryly at her enemies, she says she has something to ask those assholes, her pursuers clearly bewildered by the insolence of their captive. Still smiling wryly from behind the barrier, she asks them why the hell they want to be servants of the dark god. She mocks the name of their god, first calling him Arfi, and then asking if his name could be Arfo. She tells these stalkers that he doesn't seem to share his power with them and wonders if he's failed. They are very angry at her words and start shouting that she's just a blasphemer, telling her to watch her tongue. They also yell that the dark god will punish her. But apparently the girl doesn't pay any attention to them, because she just walks away from the place where they're clustered at the barrier she created. After leaving the place where she was before, she tries to understand how she did it, because she used this power, not having the slightest idea how to do it. She stares hard at her hand, trying to understand what is the secret of using the divine power. Alicia is uncomfortable with the fact that the only way to escape from this horrible place is the one described in the book. She heads for some tunnel, in which it is very dark. Using the information Alicia got from the novel she read in the dungeon, she realizes how to escape, and that everything happens according to the plot of the book. According to that book, at the end, there is a spring that is a prison for a knight capable of destroying the world with his power. According to the book, that knight's name is Norman Diaz. Here we realize that we have not yet fully learned the plot of the book she has read. In the novel's plot, in order to free a knight from his watery prison, her half-sister Ophelia used the power that came back to her after the death of the protagonist. Going deep into the tunnel, the girl looks around but sees no pond, no source in which a grown man can fit. But then suddenly she steps in some puddle, and very much frightened at first, not realizing what it is. Looking carefully where she stepped, it hit her. She saw what she had been looking for so long. A light was falling on the source. As if to point to this place, the girl realizes that this is the source of confinement. She takes a closer look at the spring and realizes that it looks more like a puddle than a spring with a knight in it, but decides it's worth a closer look. Taking off her shoes, she heads straight into the depths of the spring. As she gradually enters the water, she realizes that the puddle is deeper than it looks. But still the water only reaches her ankles, just thinking about it. It's as if she starts to fall under the water, which scared her a lot at first. Falling deep under the water, in a puddle she originally thought wasn't very deep. She thinks she should have known from the start that this was just a trap to lure her in. She falls backwards and heads for the very bottom. But then the girl takes control of the situation, turns over in a normal swimming position, and begins to hold on to the level to which she fell. Suddenly she touched her hand something else. She is very frightened, turns back, and sees a young man lying in the water. She notices that it is the same knight whom she was looking for. He has white hair, and he is dressed in white clothes. She looks at the knight and sees a very handsome young guy. She realizes it's Norman Diaz. He's with his eyes closed, just floating in this water, as if he's already passed out. Holding breath to keep from drowning, the girl looks at the knight, and thinking that that damn pervert Nix could keep the knight here just because of his looks, she imagines in her head how the fallen priest is in love with the knight. But then the girl realizes that this is no place to think about such things, and dispels all her stupid thoughts to focus on the most important thing, to save the world and herself. Alicia looks at the young knight in surprise and thinks it's the first time she's seen someone so handsome. She walks up to him and scrutinizes him very closely. She's obviously mesmerized by his beauty, Still not taking her eyes off the knight, the thought occurs to her that he is still so young, as if time has stood still for him. The moment he was cursed, she gently touches the young man's face. Then the excited girl suddenly grabs his chest and pulls him to her. At this moment, Alicia forgot all her plans for him. She realized that she was acting on pure instincts. Right under the water, the girl was about to kiss him, her face as close to the enchanted knight's as possible, but suddenly she stops and decides that now is not the time for these pleasures, and decided that first it is necessary to free him and to get out from under the water. She herself is starting to run out of oxygen. If she does not swim out quickly, it will be very bad for her, because she can just suffocate and die underwater. When they swim out of what she thought was a puddle, the girl realizes that she needs to seriously work on her stamina, because she will not be able to save anyone if she suffocates after a short swim. Kneeling next to the knight, she tries to catch her breath, while the knight is still unconsciously lying on the ground next to her. Looking at him, the girl who had just almost suffocated said that she almost left him there, because he was terribly heavy. But the knight does not give any sign of life and is still lying just as before. He is still unconscious. Seeing this, the girl seems to be frightened. She comes as close to him as possible, then stands on the knight and stares at him intently, wondering if this man is dead. To check if the knight is still alive, she decides to put her hand to his nose to feel if he is breathing. Doing this, she realizes that he is, thank God he is alive, but looking at him says that he looks like a sleeping princess under a spell. Although in his case he is a sleeping prince, the girl is clearly happy that she was able to release and sleep the spell of a man who by his power is able to help save the world. Alicia starts shaking the guy to get him to wake up, shaking him. She introduces herself and says that her name is Alicia Melfont and she needs his help. She asks him hard to wake up because they can't stay here for long. After the protagonist saw that the knight was still unconsciously lying there and not reacting to her words and shaking, she fell silent for a short while. Then a furious Alicia starts yelling loudly at the knight. Calling him a princess, the protagonist screams for him to wake up before the crazy demon lover finds her. Just as she said those words, Alicia heard someone calling her name from behind. She turned around to see who it was and saw what she called a crazy demon lover, Nyx. Just mentioning the devil, he immediately appeared. Mad Nyx, bowing slightly to the protagonist and still dropping the crazy smile from his face, asks where she is hiding her half-sister Ophelia. Standing next to the knight, she looks at Nyx and asks what he's talking about. Because has he forgotten what the girl said to him last time? She continues the version that Ophelia is dead. Hearing this, Nyx begins to approach the girl. He comes very close to her, and with a smile tells her that she is lying because he can feel her power flowing through the veins of the main character. The girl is clearly surprised to hear from Nyx. He takes her by the shoulder sharply and roughly. He squeezes her shoulder while she thinks that crazy bastard must have sensed Ophelia's power when she activated it to get to this place. Suddenly, the priest's attention is distracted by something from the side. He looks away, and as if to think about what he sees, it turns out that he just now noticed the knight who was freed by the girl. Surprised that she was able to save Norman Diaz, he asks how she freed him from under the water. He can't believe Alicia did it. The mad devil lover claims she didn't do it. He thinks it was Ophelia. She came here to free Norman, and Nyx, as if he were a madman, turns his head from side to side with Alicia watching, angry at him. The main character suddenly gives Nyx a smack. Her blow was so strong that his head turned the other way, and the girl finally gets to do what she's been dreaming about for so long. She gloatingly tells Nyx to taste her blow. Alicia declares that the divine power he so desperately needs is now within her. For to seal him, Ophelia used the remnants of her powers and then resurrected her, and now she is the keeper of the divine power. A distraught servant of the dark god, as if he can't believe it, and denies everything she says, saying it's just not possible. He panics, clutches his head and starts screaming. His screams are piercing. It's as if he's in another level of pain, not physical, but spiritual frustration with the work he's been doing for so long. The girl looks at him with a smile and thinks that now he knows the feeling she had to know, only because of his evil deeds. He calls the protagonist a wicked and conniving bitch. He says her half-sister Ophelia's power is not meant for the likes of her. He's holding his head and his eyes are even crazier than they were before. Nick seems to have lost his mind when he hears that the power behind him is in another person. He reaches out his hand to Alicia, but she just continues to mock him, telling him that it's just pity because he couldn't kill her even if he wanted to. The girl smirks at the suffering Nyx, and if the Dark God's follower kills her, he can say goodbye to the precious power he's been craving all this time. Nyx seems to be going even more insane, his eyes bulging so much they look like they're going to pop out of his head. He falls on his knees holding his head. Nyx still says he doesn't believe the protagonist because Ophelia is chosen by God. She couldn't die so easily. At that moment, the fallen priest starts to think about everything that has happened. He starts to cast some ancient spell. Our protagonist, seeing all this in complete shock and incomprehension, looks at him. After all, before it seemed as if she had already defeated her enemy. But now everything begins to change. Nyx abruptly grabs her by the leg, staring at the protagonist with his piercing gaze. The distraught Nyx says she is just a liar who tricked him. Surprised that the priest still doesn't believe her, the girl is very scared. She reminds him that she hit him with divine power. How can you not believe her after that? The girl in Nyx hears a voice that tells him to kill her, according to the words of the one who says it. After the death of Alicia, Ophelia will return. The girl cannot understand who said these words. In her eyes, you can see misunderstanding and fear. Nyx touches the girl's face and asks if she heard it. Turns out it's the voice of his deity, the dark god he serves. Arpho, the mad follower of the dark god, says he just needs to finish her off and then everything will go back to normal. When he finishes saying this, he reaches out his hands to the girl and begins to strangle her violently after knocking her to the ground. Once again, the distraught Nyx mentions that our protagonist has no idea what this power is for. A yellow glow begins to appear around the girl. Nyx says that the precious energy is draining out of her. This fact proves that she is not worthy of such power, even more diligently strangling the girl. He tells her to die, in fear and pain. She looks at the knight she rescued from the water and thinks she can't die like that. She just doesn't want to die, at least not like that. Still lying under Nyx, she was beginning to choke, but suddenly there was a bright flash of divine power from which he flew away from her. The girl was finally able to breathe fully. She was so hard strangled that on her neck left a trace. Someone wipes the tears from her eyes and says that now she is safe. It turned out that it was the knight woke up at such a necessary moment. He looks at the girl as if he also fell in love with her, and she realizes that not in vain saved him, and now Norman Diaz also helped her to free from the hands of Nyxa. The girl is very surprised at what she sees. A holy barrier has appeared around her and the knight, apparently the same one that helped her escape from her pursuers earlier. She looks towards Nyx. The protagonist sees that he was thrown away with such force that he is still dusty. Now it becomes clear to her why Nyx was thrown away, still wounded, but not killed. Nyx looks directly at the protagonist and tells her to come to him. He seems to call Alicia Melfont. A frightened girl looks at him as suddenly hears his voice in her head, which tells her that it will not be possible to escape from him. Also, the voice says that wherever she goes, she will definitely return to him. Hearing the voice of his main enemy in his head, the girl is very much frightened, but immediately yells at Nyx to go to the woods, watched by a clearly surprised knight who stands behind the girl. The wounded Nyx says he's giving her one last chance to sacrifice his unclean flesh to the dark god he worships. Hearing this, the girl starts walking towards him. She's clearly very angry. She concludes in her head that this asshole has been after her body all this time. Then she stops and turns to the knight she saved. He asks Alicia if the man wants to hurt her. He still hasn't fully realized what's going on around him. The girl decides to tell him everything. She says that this man really wants to hurt her because he is the fallen priest who killed everyone in Melfont Manor and sacrificed them to his dark god Arpho. The main character mentions that Nyx should not be left alive. The knight asks her if she is the daughter of House Melfont, to which the angry girl just puts her head down and says that she once was, but now she's the head of her house, the only one who survived that tragic night. so she had no choice but to say it. Hearing all this, the knight just ponders her words. Suddenly the frightened girl looks away and sees the hands of death, which have managed to kill her once before, heading in their direction again. Only this time there are a huge number of them, and they are all aimed at her, and Nyx, who controls these hands, calls her a fool. On his face there is a smile. Apparently he is already in anticipation of victory. Seeing how fast the hand of death is approaching them, the knight creates a barrier that protects them. But then the girl notices that just from one blow this hand almost broke the barrier. It cracked as if it was made of glass. And as we remember, Nyx has not one but many of these hands. The main character is hiding behind the knight. She is very scared and shaking. She asks the knight not to let Nyx kill her. She and the knight look into each other's eyes. But Norman says he's ashamed to admit it, but right now he's not strong enough to handle their enemy's onslaught. But he can buy them some time. Nyx tells Norman Diaz to give up. After all, this flimsy and barrier will not save him or the protagonist, who is also protected by just his barrier. The heroes look at him and listen with horror. A distraught follower of the Dark God says he'll tear Norman apart, and the blood that comes out of him he'll present to the Dark God. As usual, Nyx makes a sick man look sick in the head with his words and facial expressions. All the hands of death that were directed towards the heroes joined in two huge hands. They once again hit the protective barrier, from which the girl is so much frightened that falls to the ground. Giant hands so large that they enveloped the entire barrier. Lying on the ground, the girl asks herself if this is the end. Her fright is unbounded. We have never seen her so badly frightened before. But suddenly from nowhere appears a bright yellow lightning, which seems to consist of divine power. It strikes the main antagonist, from which he, coughing, falls to the ground. The shocked girl who sits behind the Holy Knight tells us who the Norman Diaz she saved is. We learn that this young man is a holy knight, with the power to upset the balance of the world. He is the one who caused the lightning that brought down their common enemy. He is one of the characters in the novel that prophesies Alicia's death. Alicia looks at him. This young man simultaneously reminds her of the danger that he is her only salvation, for only he and his strength will be able to stand up to the distraught Nyxa. One of the pillars on which this cave is held, in which the Holy Knight was imprisoned before, all cracked from what is happening. From it begins to fall small stones. The Holy Knight puts his palm over the head of the protagonist, tells her that they need to leave this place, and it should be done as soon as possible. Alicia turns around and sees Nyx lying on the floor, covered in pools of blood, but still smiling. He asks her why she is so stubborn, if she sees that everything she does will be useless in the end. He is sure that deep down the main character knows that she is just dooming herself to more suffering, and whatever she does, death will come for Alicia Melfont. The girl clutches her head. She looks very worried by Nyx's words, but still says that what he said is not true, and at least she will not just sit and wait for her death. All the while, the protagonist hears his voice in her head. This voice adds that she is nothing more than a temporary vessel for the divine power that her half-sister Ophelia possessed in the past. The Holy Knight realizes what is happening to the girl, and noticing her suffering and the way she clutches her head, asks her if she can hear his voice in her head. He clarifies that Nyx is trying to weaken her by instilling fear in her soul, adding that the girl needs to fight back. Norman is sure that the girl will cope, after all. She is the hero who saved him from imprisonment, and she can definitely survive what is happening to her now. He apologizes for his impoliteness, but reminds her that they need to hurry up. Immediately, he grabs her and lifts her up in his arms so that they both get out of this unfortunate place. The girl is a little surprised by this act on the part of the guy, but he nonchalantly turns to her and says he'll get her out of here, swearing as they both head for the exit of the cave, which is about to cave in. At this time, they were being watched by Nyx, who was still bloody lying on the floor, smiling while rocks fell past him. Norman not sparing a move and trying to get out of the cave faster and faster. Suddenly, Nyx's voice is heard again, saying to let the dark god to whom he submits guide their souls to the depths of hell, while the stones fall harder and harder. Only this time it turned out that it was not the main character who heard these words in her head, but her half-sister Ophelia, who was sleeping in a sleeping bag in a clearing. She is so much frightened by what she hears that she jumps up. He asks her how she's feeling. We find out that he's Nicholas Diaz, second son of the House of Diaz, and seemingly the younger brother of the sacred knight Alicia rescued. Waking up, Ophelia asks Nicholas how long she has been unconscious, specifying that she wants to know how many days have passed since the festival was held. She is disturbed by what is going on. The Holy Knight's younger brother tells Ophelia that it's been less than 24 hours since she lost consciousness, so she shouldn't worry, because Nix didn't get what he came for. Nicholas reminds Ophelia that they still have time before he kills her sister Alicia, while he puts his arm around her shoulder. Apparently they are also waiting for the protagonist to die, but will they? That's the question. The girl realizes that she is blacked out when she was needed most. She feels sorry for herself. But then the second knight who was with them comes up to her. He mentions that they have enough leads to find Nix, and they can find his lair, and she should just rest for now. But the girl is adamant that there is no time for that, because they have to move out. Surprised, Nicholas Diaz says they still don't know where he's holed up. But Ophelia, who had a terrible dream in which she heard Nix's voice, tells them the name of the place where their worst enemy is. He's in the Tantaros Citadel. The younger Diaz asks the second knight where this place is. The second knight tells his captain that he has never heard the name before. The girl says that she can't explain where it is, but the name and location of this citadel suddenly appeared in her mind. Ophelia turns her back to Nicholas, who thinks that Ophelia's hunch is never wrong, and if this Tantaros is indeed his base, it's probably where he can find more clues to his brother Norman's whereabouts. He has a picture in his mind of his older brother calling him and holding out his hand, and the younger one thinks that maybe his older brother is already waiting for him. He stands up, and already motivated by the meeting with his brother, tells his subordinate, whose name is Jack, to prepare for departure. He does not resist agreeing with his captain. At that moment, thanks to the magical power of the Holy Knight, Alicia takes off with him. She is very much amazed by what is happening. She wonders if she is not asleep. Norman tells the protagonist to close her eyes for a minute, but she can't do it while he's so close. Of course, it's all thoughts in her head that she doesn't tell her savior about. They land somewhere in the middle of the forest. Alicia looks around and realizes what is happening, but for the Holy Knight now the main question is whether the girl is hurt or not, which he asks her nicely, to which he gets the answer that in her opinion everything is fine and she is perfectly fine. Only after saying these words, the girl realizes that she was so focused on survival that she completely forgot that Nix had attacked her with an unclean force. In her mind, she recalls those monstrous memories of the battle with the follower of the Dark God. In her opinion, this monster ruined everything. Immediately, she sharply presses into the Holy Knight. He does not understand what is going on and asks her what is going on, but she tearfully says that she cannot breathe because it hurts her, and clutches at her throat. She asks herself if she has survived all this to die like this. We can see that this question appears in her mind very often. She seems to be fixated on it, but Norman, whom she already sees vaguely, asks her to take a hold of herself. He looks at the girl who is right in his arms, gasping, and realizes that she is suffocating from the shock. The young Holy Knight claims that he will not let Alicia die here. He apologizes to the protagonist if it seems inappropriate to her, but he does decide to untie her dress, which was constricting her airway because it was tightly tied. Finally, the girl with tears in her eyes comes to her senses again. She looks at Norman, who asks her if she's feeling any better, but the main character is most surprised that she's still alive. She looks at her hands and realizes that the course of events has changed, because Nix didn't manage to kill her as it was described in the book. While in Norman's arms, she says she was very scared, but still managed to get out of there alive. Norman promises her that she's safe now, and everything will be okay. The weeping protagonist remembers the words that Deeks told her, namely that she can't run from death forever. She wonders if she can avoid this tragic end that was described in the novel that she was reading. Seeing the girl's not the best condition, Norman asks her to lean her head on his shoulder, because in his opinion all she needs now is a simple dream. Meanwhile, in the citadel of Tantaros, Norman's younger brother walks with his subject. The subjects ask Nicholas what he thinks happened here, because everything is in ruins. Suddenly, Jack informs the captain that they found a heretic priest, and he is now lying crushed under the beams. Ophelia, being frightened, asks Nicholas to go after the priest from the temple, because it is necessary to seal their enemy as quickly as possible. But Norman's younger brother turns around and goes to Jack with the words to show him the way quickly. Ophelia looks up into the sky and thinks that when Nyx is sealed, they will find out, and she can't figure out what's going on. But she senses that something has changed. Obviously, she senses the changes that have been brought about by the heroic actions of her sister and older brother, Nicholas. It's already night outside. Norman and the main character have built a fire, and while the girl is sleeping, Norman is thinking about something. They set up under a big tree in the middle of the woods. Norman looks at his surroundings and realizes that the world hasn't changed at all. But then he lowers his head, looks at the girl, and thinks about the fact that now he is destined to be the head of the house, as he is the only one who survived. Norman becomes sad because he realizes how much has happened while he slept in Nyx's confinement. He hard to imagine how they suffered. He remembers his younger brother. An image of Nicholas calling for his older brother appears in his head while someone grabs him. Norman blames you for everything that happened and says it's his fault. Norman recalls how one day he was sitting on the grass with his friend and decided to reveal his real name to him. He told his friend that his name is Norman Diaz Zoe. From the look on his friend's face, it is clear that there is something wrong with this name. It turns out that Zoe is a God-given name that is only used within the family. The Holy Knight then revealed his name to the fallen paladin, a comrade and dear friend with whom he had gone through many hardships. He then told his friend that he had informed him of his real name because he considered him a brother. The fallen paladin's name is Iago. Norman considered his friend Iago a member of his family, but even though they fought together as heroes of the Empire, Norman's trust failed him. He recalls a terrible incident in his life, namely how his close friend Iago grabbed his younger brother and held a dagger to his face, asking death to come and destroy and disperse the soul of his enemy, Norman Diaz Zoe. Iago looked as if anger and hatred were overwhelming him. At the time, Norman was blind and did not see the hatred that was hidden deep within the heart of his close friend. Taking advantage of what Norman had told him, Iago cast an ancient curse that required the real name of the victim. Norman begged his friend not to do it, for the curse always costs the caster dearly. But a smiling Iago said he had hated his supposed friend since their very first meeting. Evil forces enveloped Norman's body. His body seemed to crack like glass, while his enemies said that everything would be fine without him. He asked Norman to just give up and die. Norman's eyes filled with tears, and his little brother saw this and tried to break free from his ex-boyfriend's arms, yelling for him to let go. But Iago was undeterred, and because his ex-boyfriend wouldn't let go of his little brother, when he reached out to Norman crying, something incredible happened. The moment Nicholas reached out to his brother, he awakened a divine power and thereby weakened the curse placed on his brother. Had it not happened, Norman's flesh would have turned to ashes. At that moment, Norman just seemed to fall into the abyss. He heard the words of his friend who wished him to die and disappear forever. He seemed to fall lower and lower, and remembering the words of his confidant, he seemed to fall asleep and only helplessly waited for the end. But suddenly everything changed when he heard Alicia's words that she didn't want to die. His anticipation of the end lasted until he heard her voice, until she touched his face then in the water. The girl was still sleeping on his lap, but suddenly she began to make strange noises, which confused Norman a little. He looked at her and saw that she seemed to be suffering from something, looking more closely. He decides to check if she has a fever, but only after touching her forehead he realizes that she is incredibly hot. The girl looks very exhausted. Not only is she covered in wounds, but also with a fever. He looks at his hand and realizes that he shouldn't rely on it too much, but he has no other choice, so he uses his divine power to heal the girl. His hand begins to glow, and he holds it up to Alicia's forehead to heal her. Norman looks at Alicia and realizes that she is very sick. He is surprised that she was able to get him out of the lake with such severe wounds, although he is not that light. Covering the protagonist with a blanket, Norman realizes that her fear of death has given her a lot of strength to go on. But after he watches her sleeping peacefully, he realizes that it could also be a desire to live. Norman is surprised that this girl has such a strong will to live. Now he wonders what kind of person she is. He thinks that maybe he will learn more about her when she wakes up. but we as viewers realize that there are a lot of similarities between them. They have both been betrayed and both tried to be killed. Looking up at the sky, Norman can't even remember the last time he was this excited before tomorrow. All of this was possible thanks to Alicia's sacrifice. She wakes up and first touches your hands, surprised that they are still there. Then she looks at your shaking palms and makes sure she is not dead yet. Alicia is happy that she's still alive. When she gets up, she realizes that everything happened. Not according to the plot of the fucking book she read. Suddenly the girl looks around and sees a bed, which of course surprises her, because she fell asleep in the woods, and she starts to reconstruct a logical chain of events. And she remembers escape from Tantaros and everything else is a blur. She's grabbing her head because she can't remember anything. It's probably really annoying. She looks around again, trying to figure out where she is and what this place is. She's clearly confused by what's going on around her. Norman opens the front door of the house and immediately says hello, saying he is back. In his hands, we can see a whole basket of apples. He looks very happy, but suddenly he hears someone asking another person who he is. Norman is shocked by what he sees. He drops the basket of apples from his hands. It turned out that Alicia, who was already awake, grabbed the other man's chest and started shaking him, telling him not to think he could fool her and to tell her who he was. She thought he was Nix's servant, but the man said he was just an old man. Norman gets in front of the girl and tells her to calm down. For these kind people, let them stay in their house for free, the old man hiding behind his back. But the girl still does not calm down. She looks at the holy knight and tells him that it sounds even more suspicious. For why would they do it without any profit? The old man says that their clothes were torn to shreds, so he knew at once that they were penniless. The protagonist at first says that she doesn't understand what we are talking about, but then looking at herself, she realizes that she is wearing her grandmother's nightgown. She has lost one earring, and on her fingers from jewelry there is only a ring with a signet that can't be sold. She doesn't even have shoes. And these are all the things of our protagonist. She is a beggar, after all. The girl falls to the floor. She's upset that she doesn't have her silk dress and jewelry. Norman apologizes for her, but the older men say it's okay. The Holy Knight thanks them for their understanding and mentions that this girl has been through a lot, and the old people looking at him say that he is a very kind young man. Norman picked up all the apples from the floor, closed the door, and started talking to the main character. He said she must not understand anything, but he thought she would wake up later, and says he should have come back sooner to explain everything to her. Though either way, he's happy to see her back on her feet. The protagonist looks at her hands and is surprised to notice that all of hers have healed early, still a little unsure of what's going on. She looks at the Holy King and asks why she was able to recover so quickly from the amount of wounds she had. Norman smiles when he hears this question. But then the girl asks another, asking if a divine force is responsible for this. Satisfied, Norman goes on with the apples and puts them on the floor. He says the girl must be hungry, so he brought apples. They are gathered from the woods nearby, for they have no money, so temporarily they will eat like this. He chooses a beautiful red apple and gives it to the girl. He says that she cannot worry because the apple is not poisoned. She takes the apple and looks at it very carefully. The girl asks Norman a question. She asks who changed her while she was unconscious. Norman was a little surprised by this question, but immediately answered. It turned out that the girl was dressed by an old lady, because the dress of the protagonist was very wet and dirty. The girl was satisfied with the answer. But besides that, she had another question. She asks Norman how long it's been since they escaped, and where they are, because she really needs to know, but decides to tell her what happened to their enemy after the destruction of his Tantaros base. The Holy Knight clarifies the name of the man, and certifies that the gaunt priest who fought him is named Nix. The girl says she really needs to know what happened to him. Norman says that their enemy has taken the full impact infused with divine power and is now likely to be paralyzed for weeks, or even possibly for a period of time longer. Norman considers it his personal shame that he was unable to take on the enemy when he had the chance. But that's because the long imprisonment took a lot of his strength. The girl looks at Norman saying all this and realizes that she is a little frightened by the way he says such things with such a nice smile. It turns out that the protagonist fell asleep and slept like that for about 2 days. Since the escape from the citadel, she is surprised that she fell asleep because she thought she had lost consciousness. It turns out that the Holy Knight came across this village while carrying the protagonist through the forest. He remembers that this place was called Thule. The smart girl realizes that it seems that this village is on the border of the Empire and the East Coast. Surprised, Norman says that the girl seems to know about maps. But she thinks about something else, because the place where they are is not so far away from the headquarters of the Romdak Guild. They will not be so difficult to get back to the Empire. But then the Sacred Knight has a question. It turned out that he has long wanted to ask how the girl knew that he was in the lake. He cannot understand how she knew about it. He does not quite fully understand it. He says that the girl is his savior, but he doesn't even know her name, or even the reason for his rescue. He's thinking about it for sure, trying to understand how and when the girl found out about him. It's obvious to the protagonist that she can't say that she read about the Holy Knight in a book, because it sounds crazy to her, but if the girl doesn't want to tell the truth, she has to change the subject. Instead of telling the truth, she says she just heard that the firstborn of House Diaz went missing a long time ago, and when she found him sealed in this lake in Tantaros, her intuition tells her, and she said her intuition told her that Norman was the firstborn son of the Diaz family. But after hearing all this, Norman wants to know more about it. Based on her assessment of her own intuition, he then asks if she knows why Nix is hunting so hard for his head and the girl. The girl opens the Holy Knight's eyes. She says they are his main target because he wants to become the pursuer of the harp god. The action shifts to thousands of years ago. Arfo unleashed the 7 deadly sins on the world. And that's when people first started killing each other with acquired dark powers. Seeing the death of her good people, Mayera, who is the goddess of life and creator of the world, who breathed her divine power into the people, slew the demon, and sealed him away. After all this, the goddess Mayera encapsulated the dark curses of the dark god Arfo on the page of a secret folio to erase them from the memories of her children forever. The people placed this folio in the depths of the temple to hide it until the end of time. But Nix, endowed with strong divine powers, was able to find this forbidden folio quite easily. Then he gathered his followers and told them to let out their hatred and curse their enemies, for this is the only path that leads to true liberation. The cursed magic of the dark god and the control it gave over others was too sweet a temptation for priests like Nix, simple priests striving to be gods. After defeating Norman, he locked the paladin in his lair as a memorial trophy, as Arfo's new servant, which is why Norman was under the curse all this time. The protagonist considers herself a very honest person, but even so, she can't tell him to his face that he was a living trophy of a demon. The waiting Norman looks a little upset at the response. She decides to tell him only part of what she knows. The girl tells Norman that using divine power, Nix sealed him and his curse and went to her family's estate. She thinks it's not entirely a lie. Until then, he was still a priest of Mayera, a backstory she knows from the novel, until he sacrificed the people of Melfont Manor, after which he was given the power of darkness. It's a scary story that Alicia wouldn't want to know about. At the end, Nix was defeated by her similar sister Ophelia, but he was resurrected by his followers, and the first thing he did, upon his return, was kidnap her. Norman tells the girl that he is sorry for her loss, but the smiling girl says it's in the past, and asks if her story helped Norman. He answers in the affirmative, and thanks the girl. Norman realizes again that a lot has happened in the last 10 years. The owner of the house they are in told him that this year is the 500th anniversary of the founding of the Lotan Empire. He thinks that his younger brother Nicholas must be a grown man now. He is ashamed that his brother has been worrying about him all these years. Norman happily remembers his dear little brother. In his mind, it's still a little boy, but the protagonist says she saw him on a couple of evenings, and now in her mind, it's a grown man. When Norman hears this, he is surprised that Alicia has met his brother before, and asks how he is now. The girl says he is well, very well. But in her head, she thinks that of course he is well. He is courting Ophelia. She tells Norman that he'll be surprised to see how much he's grown. But in her head, she characterizes him differently. She'd like to tell him that he'll be surprised to see what an arrogant jerk he's become. But of course, the girl doesn't say that. Norman says he can't wait to see his brother. He's so happy to hear that. He lights up when he hears about his brother. Alicia says she's happy for him. But then the Holy Knight remembers that the girl still hasn't told him her name, and the girl asks him for permission to introduce herself properly. She says her name is Alicia, and she is the head of the House of Melfont and the Romdak Trade Guild. Dear friends, if you liked this manga and you want to get its sequel quickly, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to not miss new videos. The continuation of this video will be released when this video will collect 5.000 likes or more than 30.000 views. Send this video to your friends. Write comments and do not forget to be as active as possible on the channel to speed up the release of new videos. This manga is called I Will Rewrite My Tragic Ending. Thank you for watching. Bye.